Okay, this video lecture will cover Latin American history, at least through the 20th century. And of course, we're talking about the Western Hemisphere from the border of Mexico with the United States all the way down to the tip of South America. Okay, so we've already covered the age of exploration, the age of colonization. You know that Spain is the largest entity that will be present in what we will call Latin America. Portugal, because of the accidents of early explorations, will have a claim to Brazil. The Caribbean islands will partly be Spanish, but then it'll be the French to a little extent, and then the British that will take over a lot of the islands in the Caribbean, of course, to produce sugar. Now, Latin America is going to be affected, at least to some extent, by some of the same revolutionary ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and in particular, the political revolutions that happened in the United States, in France. Those will begin to affect at least the intellectual elite that exist in Latin American countries. In this particular slide, there's a term called Creole, Creole, but Creole in English. This refers to people of European descent, but are born in the Americas. So we're talking about Spanish people, Portuguese people, who are born in the New World, as they would call it, but are of European extraction, not in any way mixed with African or indigenous people that are present in the Americas. So we have all these intellectual ideas, and the Creoles are starting to get upset that they're not allowed to become as prosperous and wealthy as they might be, because the governments back in Spain or Portugal are limiting their access to full economic and political activities. And the inspiration of the American Revolution in particular, a colonial power that breaks off of the mother country, that has a powerful resonance in Latin America. And in the early 1800s, the Napoleonic Wars are going to interfere with Spain and Portugal's ability to stay on top of things, because Napoleon is going to be fighting in these areas, and in particular Spain will become, for a number of years, under the control of French forces. Again, Enlightenment thinkers that are influencing these guys. Creole discontent. Here's the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen from the French Revolution. These ideas are circulating in the elites in Latin America. Napoleon. So what starts to happen, and this is really close to all these events coalescing together, especially the Napoleonic Wars, is one after another, the colonies of Spain, divided up in these various provinces, are going to rebel against the local government supported by Spanish forces that are often not terribly numerous. And one after another, in a series of rebellions, revolutions, wars of independence, all of these countries are going to become independent of Spain. Brazil's got its own separate story. They're a little bit different, but essentially the same process will happen, but it takes a little bit more time with Brazil. Now, this is an amazing figure. This is Toussaint Louverture, who is black. This is an African descendant of slaves in the country that we now call Haiti. This is the island of Hispaniola, and in one of the many wars, treaty negotiations, France was given this part of Hispaniola, and Spain had this part. This will evolve into Haiti, and this will evolve into the modern country of the Dominican Republic. And to this day, in Haiti, they speak French. In the Dominican Republic, they speak Spanish. Toussaint Louverture is this amazingly talented, charismatic figure, and he leads a revolution of black slaves to overthrow the French rulers of Haiti. And he has a large degree of success. He nearly pulls it off. Napoleon is forced to expend a lot of resources in sending French armies to deal with this. And it's a bit of a side story, but the Louisiana Purchase probably would never have happened had it not been for this slave revolt. Because when Napoleon acquired the Louisiana territories, or the claim to the Louisiana territories, he had every intention of sending an army over to begin to occupy New Orleans and begin to do something with this area west of the Mississippi. But he had to divert that army to deal with this slave rebellion. And even though ultimately they were successful, they captured him, imprisoned him, and they put down the revolt, so many French soldiers died in fighting, but mostly to diseases, that the army that Napoleon would have sent to the Louisiana territories, that army disappeared. He didn't have it. And it was at that moment when he realized that it wasn't going to work, that he approached the United States with an offer to sell the territory to the United States in exchange for a chunk of cash. Now here is the greatest figure of the Latin American revolutions, Simón Bolívar. He's the George Washington of Latin America, at least to some extent, because his life will not turn out very well. He'll fail in his greatest dreams, but he's the main political military leader of the rebellion against Spain. He's a Creole, Spanish blood, but born in the Americas. Spent time in Europe and the United States, absorbing all these new ideas about independence. San Martin, José de San Martin, is probably the second most important figure in the Latin American revolutions. So in a series of dramatic military operations, the rebel armies spanning huge distances up and down the length of South America, and at one point crossing the Andes in a feat of arms that was probably close to as difficult as what Hannibal did when he crossed the Alps to sneak up on the Romans. Incredibly difficult, hard, severe fightings with major battles. Ultimately, they win. Spanish forces are just not able to keep up with the energy and the extent to all these revolutionary activities. And you see where there are major battles fought. So this is the earliest vision that Bolivar had. I mean, ultimately, his vision was that all of Spanish America would be united into one huge country. And that's never going to happen. But he does start off with this idea of Grand Colombia, which includes the modern nations of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador. I think that's the extent. Oh, sorry, all the way up into Panama as well, Central America. He died of a broken heart. I mean, not literally, but he died of extreme disappointment because there just wasn't enough vision among the other revolutionary leaders to somehow forge a unified national entity. And so Latin America will break up into independent countries that all go their own ways. So this is how things fall out by the time we get to the year 1836. Mexico actually was the first one. And then Bolivar, San Martin. There's an ex-Irish, or Irish descent leader in Argentina. His name is O'Higgins. His name was Bernardo O'Higgins. And there's a big statue of him in Buenos Aires. Okay, so the Portuguese royal family, after Napoleon invaded, they moved to Brazil, and the entire family basically took over Brazil as their new kingdom. And they will last until about 1822. Okay, so we have all these results. There's O'Higgins. All these countries are now independent, but no unity. They just can't pull it off. A lot of these countries have factional struggles for who's going to control them, so you have civil wars. And then the obvious thing is South America has got tremendous geographic diversity. So you've got the Amazon, you've got the Andes, you've got the coastal regions, you've got these huge rainforests. That doesn't lend itself to a united country. And in the chaos of all of this political chaos, you have a lot of economic factors and tremendous poverty among the lower classes. So here's what happens. And to a degree, this is the fault of the basic governmental structure of Spain. Spain had like zero experience in anything other than an absolutist royal regime. There's no representative assemblies, there's no consultative bodies, nothing like that. So inheriting this idea from Spain, the idea is that the best way for a government to function is to have a strong man, a very tough leader who has all the power. And the term that's used, it's almost a political science term, is caudillo, the caudillo system. And these are people that are going to become dictators. And usually they're based on their military activities. They're almost always wealthy, white, Creole aristocrats. And one country after another, even if it started with popular control, like in Mexico, the earliest rebellion against Spanish rule was led by a priest named Father Hidalgo. And that's actually a peasant uprising. But as soon as they effectively end Spanish rule in Mexico, the wealthy aristocrats seize control of Mexico and they push any kind of lower class presence aside in the new government, and they assume this type of rule, dictatorship from the top, from the upper class. So this is going to be the pattern in Latin America for a very long time. In fact, it's really just been the last generation that most Latin American countries have achieved some degree of democracy and elections that are fair and free. And there's still tons of problems. I'll get into that a little bit when I finish this lecture. Coup d'etat. There's this conception that Latin America, that any Latin American country, the government may last a year, 2 years, a few years, and then there's some other group that elbows aside the one dictator and another dictator takes his place. The term that will be applied to this in the 20th century will be the concept of the banana republic. There's a lot of complexity to that term, but it essentially means countries that are always prone to military coups in which the dictators change hands with another dictator. This political cartoon is illustrating this. So we start off with the years of Spanish oppression. Then Spain is kicked out, but then the Creole aristocracy takes over, and now they're a military dictatorship. And this, in this case, this represents the nation of Peru, the Peruvian people, many of them who are indigenous, Indians, being controlled by these military dictators. And you could substitute Peru for Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Colombia. It's an incredibly common pattern. There's just tremendous problems in trying to forge these new nations. Land disputes, the failure to reform, factional conflicts, the geographic barriers that I mentioned. Many of these countries are going to have a really hard time putting themselves together as functional political entities, and prosperity will elude them for a long time. So it's time now to begin talking about the American presence, the presence of the United States in the future of Latin America. So this particular map, which is labeled the American Lake, the Caribbean, I'm not going to go into details, but this reveals the essential pattern, especially in the territories closer to the United States. Every one of these dates that you see, the span of years, represents American military action in various Caribbean countries, all including Mexico. We are the big brother. We're the cop. We're the policeman. Whenever Americans see that there's something going on that will threaten American economic interests, the Marines are sent in to take care of whatever problem there is. Needless to say, the political development of these countries, well, let's be fair. It would have been problematic even if the United States did not exist. But it doesn't help to have Big Brother constantly saying, listen, this is the way you got to do things. You can't figure these things out on your own. The Colossus of the North. The Monroe Doctrine is an amazing initiative by the government of the United States, starting with President James Monroe. Essentially, it says to Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. No more colonization, no more attempts to recolonize, just stay out. It implicitly states that the United States is going to assume a protector status to all of Latin America. In other words, we're saying that Latin America is in our backyard. And if anybody's going to influence events in Latin America, it will be the Colossus of the North, the United States, and not European countries. And even though this is earlier in our history and we're not a very powerful military entity, the United States is able to make this stick. The only time that a European country tries to get a foothold in Latin America, it's because of the American Civil War. We're so tied up with the American Civil War that when the French attempt to seize control of Mexico, we're not in a position to stop that. But as soon as the Civil War is over, in combination with a very successful revolution against French rule, the French are expelled, and nothing like that is ever attempted again. there's something called the Spanish-American War that takes place in 1898, in which we assist Cuban rebels. Cuba is kind of almost the last holdout of the Latin American countries still controlled by Spain. For various reasons, which I won't go into now, the United States decides that we have to intervene militarily. The U.S. declares war on Spain, and in just a few months, we defeat Spanish navies and Spanish ground forces in Cuba, and now Cuba is independent, at least to some extent, with a firm understanding that they need to basically take direction from the United States government. And Theodore Roosevelt publishes this idea, it's called the Roosevelt Corollary, that the U.S. is going to be the policeman for the Americas, keeping order. And again, these are countries in Latin America in which the U.S. intervened frequently militarily. And then there's the Panama Canal. Now, this is an incredibly great and beneficial engineering project. This is a great gift of American engineering might to the world. This will cause prosperity for lots and lots of nations, not just the United States. But Theodore Roosevelt, who after the French failed in their attempt to build a canal, he decides that now it's America's turn to do it. But he insists that when we do build a canal, that we will have exclusive control over it and territory on either side of the canal. The problem is that Panama is controlled by Colombia. Panama is a province of the nation of Colombia. And even when he offers a lot of money to Colombia to buy this, they say, no, we can't do that. We won't do that. They refuse. So, not to be deterred, Roosevelt engineers a coup. He approaches leading figures in Panama and says, would you like to be an independent country? Oh, yes, yes, we would. So he says, go ahead and do it. Just declare independence. And U.S. agents basically bribed Colombian troops in Panama to not resist or fight this. And when the nation of Colombia tried to send military forces to put down the rebellion, American naval vessels blocked them from doing it. And so it was a done deal. So as soon as Panama gains independence in this way, they sign a treaty with us ceding to the United States this land to permanent U.S. control, and then we begin the actual project. The Panama Canal takes about 10 years to dig. They finish it in 1914. And the United States will control this area all the way up until the 1970s, when President Jimmy Carter basically negotiates with the nation of Panama to turn the canal back over to the nation of Panama, and that's how it exists now. Famous, famous cartoon. Theodore Roosevelt carrying a big stick, which is based on one of his favorite sayings, speak softly but carry a big stick, leading American military naval forces around to police Latin America, especially the Caribbean. Now, Mexico, after the French episode is finished, there's this charismatic figure named Benito Juarez, which is as close as Mexico has to a George Washington figure. He's actually Indian. He's almost, I think, entirely of Indian descent. And he leads the revolution to get the French out. And for just a short period of time, we have a popular leader with democratic ideals in charge of Mexico. And Juarez was a huge fan of Abraham Lincoln. And he's trying to do a Lincoln thing in Mexico. But again, the social forces in Mexico are such that this wealthy elite just will not sit idly by and let something different develop. And after Juarez is gone, there's now a series of very harsh and brutal dictators that rule Mexico with an iron fist. And all the benefits, the social benefits, the land, go to the control of the wealthy elite. In 1910, things explode. There's so much peasant unrest and anger at the control of this elite that Mexico erupts in what is called the Revolution of 1910. It really is a long series of civil wars fought between various factions and revolutionary leaders. And it'll go on and on and on and on. And when it finally, and here's some of the major characters. The most famous probably would be Pancho Villa. Zapata also. All of these people are part of this long conflict in Mexico. And I'd love to say that something happened positive when it was all over. And a little bit did. There was some land reform. Some large estates were broken up and given to Mexican peasants. There was some land reform. But when all the dust settled, see, here's details about this. I don't want to cover all these things. But when all of the dust settled, Mexico settled into a long period of one-party rule, the PRI, and I'm forgetting exactly what that stands for in Spanish, but the PRI party dominated Mexico until pretty recently, until the 1980s, when finally somebody else was able to run against them and win a fair election. And what the PRI did is basically they would select among themselves one guy who would become the dictator, and he would serve for a while as the president, and then there'd be another election, which wasn't really an election, and only PRI guys could run. And they kept that system up until the election of Vicente Fox. Oh my goodness, I guess that was in the 1980s or 90s. I'm forgetting exactly the date. But Mexico is now, I want to finish the story, Mexico is now a functioning democracy. They have elections that are, for the most part, fair. There's problems, and Mexico's got terrible problems right now with drug cartels. But the reality is that Mexico is now a functioning democracy and seems to be moving in the right direction. Okay, here's the term economic imperialism. This applies to what the United States is going to do in Latin America all the way deep into the 20th century. I'd say at least until maybe the 1960s or 70s, when some of this starts to break down. The United States, even though we will have a colony that we take over from Spain, the Philippines, the United States will not do what the British did or the French did or other European countries did with Africa. We are never going to seize control of countries in South America and rule them directly as American colonies, with the American flag and a colonial governor. We just won't do that. Partly it's against American ideals, but partly it's not necessary. This is a much more efficient way to get something out of what could be a colony, but you don't have the responsibility of running it as a colony. Again, it's economic imperialism. The United States, with its tremendous wealth and industrial might, begins to invest very heavily in Latin America, to the point where there is so much American money that is moving into various ventures in Latin America that the United States essentially, the word control is too strong, but we are like the dominant influence, because all of the money that generates wealth for these countries is directly or indirectly related to American investment and American activities. Let me just take copper, which is one of the main products in the country of Chile. And this is not governmental action. This is American mining corporations. They will approach the dictator of Chile and say, we, with our expertise, we will develop copper mines in your country. We will employ tens of thousands of Chileans as workers. It'll be great for your country to let us do this. And incidentally, here's a big bag of cash that we would like to present you personally for your assistance in letting this happen. So essentially buying off the political leaders, the Americans will then begin all of this mining activity, and the copper is extracted and it goes to the United States for use in our tremendous industrial engine. And what does Chile get out of it? Well, it's true, there is employment for Chilean laborers, and there's sacks of money for the political leaders, but that's it. This national resource, all this copper that belongs to Chile, the Chilean people and the government don't get any cut of this. There's no taxes. There's no direct control. There's no Chilean companies that are in charge of copper production. None whatsoever. It goes directly to the Americans. And you can look at all these other areas, not just mining activities like silver, tin, nitrates, but American companies will come and build railways. American engineers will build railways, using local labor. But as soon as the railways are built, the United States retains control, the company, the railroad company, maintains control over that railway, and they charge the fees, they get the profits, and all the profits go into the pockets of the American railway investors. Look at all these products: beef, hides, coffee, rubber, bananas. I don't have time to go through it, but it's incredible the power of one particular U.S. multinational corporation. It's called United Fruit. United Fruit is going to essentially take over, especially the country of Guatemala, but also parts of Costa Rica and Nicaragua. United Fruit, a private company, will own so much territory in these Central American countries for banana plantations that the local leaders have zero control over taxes, over working conditions, and again, all the profits go directly to United Fruit, and nothing goes to the nation of Guatemala to help build up, its infrastructure or benefit its citizens. It's extraordinary how efficiently this whole thing is done. All right, here's some pie charts that show the immense presence of American investments in Latin America. You can see how Latin America is the gigantic repository of huge amounts of investments. More than Europe, more than Asia. And then this is the types of activities that occur in Latin America with U.S. investments. Mining and smelting is the biggest chunk. Agriculture, bananas, coffee, railroads, public utilities. That means that American companies will go in and set up the electrical grid for a country like Bolivia. But then we don't turn it over to the nation of Bolivia to manage and run it and collect the fees. The Americans continue to collect the fees for the people that use the electricity forever, or at least up until modern times. Okay, and that ends these slides. Let me just quickly summarize Latin America and bring it kind of up to the present. As I said, democracy has taken a pretty good foothold in most Latin American countries. There's just a couple of exceptions right now. The most glaring one is Venezuela, which has a kind of a left-wing dictatorship going on since the time of a guy named Hugo Chavez, who's now dead, but his successors trying to continue his very failed policies. But most Latin American countries have got elections. Brazil was doing pretty well for a while, but their electoral process has gone off the rails. They just impeached a president, and the new guys got accusations of corruption. Brazil's a mess right now. But by and large, Latin American countries are getting closer and closer to having actual democratic processes become part of their deal. And bit by bit, and this has sometimes been done peacefully, sometimes not, Latin American countries have asserted control over all of these activities. The United States still invests very heavily in Latin America, and we're still the major trading partner with Latin American countries. But the days of economic imperialism have largely, at least the overt of imperialism, like I described earlier, that's gone. Okay, and that does it. That's the history of Latin America from the time of their revolutions from Spain up more or less to the present day. Very good.